If you think you can dress like that in my building without consequences, you don't understand me at all. The voice cut through the glass walls of Reed Enterprises like a blade, calm, controlled, and dangerously precise. Emily Carter froze in front of the elevator mirror, her hands still lightly adjusting the hem of her skirt after a long day of work. She hadn't expected anyone to be on this floor at this hour, especially not him, Alexander Reed, the man who owned the building, the company. And every rumor whispered in its hallways. She slowly turned her head, meeting his reflection in the polished steel doors. He stood several feet away, but the space between them felt smaller than physics allowed. His presence didn't demand attention. It erased everything else. Mr. Reed, I was just heading out, she said carefully, forcing her voice to stay professional even as her heartbeat tightened. Alexander stepped closer, unhurried, deliberate, the way someone moves when they know time belongs to them. His gaze flicked briefly downward, not intrusive, but observant in a way that made her hyper-aware of every detail she hadn't thought mattered a moment ago, then returned to her eyes. Who told you to dress this daring? He asked again, quieter this time, but heavier, like the question carried more meaning than words should hold. Emily swallowed, confusion tightening in her chest. It wasn't about fashion, she realized. It was about control, perception, and something she couldn't yet name. I didn't realize there was a dress code for leaving the office, she replied, attempting a small, controlled edge of humor. It didn't land. Alexander didn't smile, didn't soften. Instead, he pressed the elevator button beside her, the metal click echoing sharply in the quiet space. The doors slid shut with a smooth chime, enclosing them in a mirrored box that reflected neither escape nor comfort, only tension. Emily's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the strange intensity of being fully noticed. Alexander Reed was not a man who missed details. That was something everyone in his company understood. He noticed patterns, errors, intentions, and apparently her. You stay late too. Often, he said after a pause, his tone shifting slightly away from the earlier edge. That's not required. Emily blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. I like finishing my work, she answered. It's quieter then. Alexander studied her for a moment longer than necessary, as if measuring something invisible behind her words, then turned slightly, breaking the direct pressure without fully releasing it. Quiet can be dangerous in this building, he said almost under his breath. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the lobby floor. The doors began to open, spilling warm city light into the enclosed space. Emily should have stepped out immediately, should have left the moment behind like she did every other night. But for half a second she didn't move. Something in the air felt unfinished, unresolved. Alexander spoke again before she could decide. Next time you adjust something like that. His voice lowered just enough to make it personal, without crossing into anything inappropriate. Make sure you're not standing where everyone can see you. Then he stepped aside, not blocking her, not stopping her, but making space in a way that felt more intentional than restraint. Emily walked into the lobby, her thoughts heavier than when she arrived, and behind her, she felt his gaze follow her not as ownership, not as command, but as if she had become a question he had no intention of leaving unanswered. Emily stepped out into the lobby with her thoughts still tangled. The warm glow of the city lights outside the glass doors contrasting sharply with the cold precision of the building behind her. She told herself it was nothing, just another late evening in a demanding workplace. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered in a way she could not easily dismiss. Outside, the night air of downtown Chicago carried the sound of distant traffic and footsteps on wet pavement from an earlier light rain. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and started walking toward the parking structure connected to the building, trying to focus on the normal rhythm of leaving work. But halfway across the lobby, she noticed movement near the reception desk. Daniel Brooks, one of the senior assistants, nodded politely as he passed her, his expression unreadable but tense in the way most employees at Reed Enterprises often looked, as if even casual interactions were carefully measured. You are leaving late again, he said as a statement more than a question. Emily offered a small polite smile. It happens more often than I would like, she replied. Daniel hesitated as if considering saying more, but stopped himself, instead glancing briefly toward the upper floors where the executive offices were located. Emily followed his glance instinctively, and for a fraction of a second, she thought she saw a silhouette behind the glass, a familiar stillness that made her chest tighten slightly. But when she looked again, it was gone. She dismissed it as exhaustion and continued walking, unaware that above her Alexander Reed stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the movement of the lobby below with quiet focus. His assistant entered the room holding a tablet but paused when she noticed his attention was elsewhere. "She is still in the building," Daniel Brooks said carefully, as if confirming something already known. Alexander did not turn. "I am aware," he replied simply, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made further explanation unnecessary. He finally stepped away from the window and moved toward his desk, but his focus remained divided. Moments later, Emily reached the parking garage elevator, pressing the button and waiting under the flickering fluorescent light that gave the space a slightly hollow feeling. A few seconds passed before the doors opened, and she stepped inside alone, the mirrored walls reflecting her tired expression back at her. She exhaled slowly, trying to release the tension she could not fully name. As the elevator descended, she replayed the earlier moment in the lobby and the strange intensity in Alexander Reed's voice. She told herself it was just authority, just a powerful executive with a strong presence, nothing more. But when the doors opened to the parking level, she paused again. Her car was parked near the far end of the row beneath a dim overhead light, and as she walked toward it, she noticed a black vehicle parked 2 spaces away that she did not remember seeing before. The engine was off, no movement inside, yet something about its placement felt deliberate. She unlocked her car quickly, sliding inside and locking the doors immediately out of habit rather than fear. As she started the engine, she looked up through the windshield and saw a figure standing near the elevator entrance above the garage ramp, too far to make out clearly but still unmistakably watching. And even from that distance, she felt the same pressure of attention she had felt all evening, controlled, silent, and unrelenting, like a presence that did not need to be close to be certain she would not be ignored. Emily started the car, the engine breaking the silence of the parking garage with a low, steady hum that did little to calm the tension in her chest. She adjusted the rearview mirror and forced herself to look forward instead of upward toward the glass exit ramp where she had seen the figure moments earlier, telling herself it was exhaustion, stress, and nothing more than the lingering pressure of a long workday. She pulled out of the parking space slowly, headlights cutting across concrete pillars as she navigated toward the exit. The garage felt larger than usual, almost emptier, with each turn echoing softly like the space itself was paying attention. When she reached the main ramp leading to the street level, she noticed a black SUV paused near the exit gate, stationary in a way that felt intentional rather than incidental. Its headlights were off, but the engine appeared to be running. Emily hesitated for only a second before continuing forward, her car passing within a few feet of it, and in that brief moment, she thought she saw movement inside, a silhouette in the driver's seat that turned slightly, as if tracking her. She looked away quickly and focused on the road ahead as the gate lifted and she merged into Chicago night traffic. The city outside was alive with motion. Taxis, delivery trucks, and office workers heading home under streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. Emily exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes and told herself again that nothing unusual had happened, just coincidence, just overthinking. But 10 minutes into her drive, she noticed something unusual in her rearview mirror, a black SUV maintaining distance behind her, not too close, not too far, always matching her turns and lane changes with quiet precision. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel and took a longer route toward her apartment, making a turn she did not normally take. Yet the SUV followed without hesitation. When she stopped at a red light, she glanced again and saw it still there, 2 cars behind her, stationary and patient. Emily's phone buzzed in the cup holder, and she flinched slightly before checking it. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen reading simply, "You are driving home late again." Her breath caught, and she immediately locked her phone, telling herself it could be a coincidence, a wrong number, or something automated. But the timing felt too precise, too aware. She drove the remaining distance faster than usual, heart rate rising as she approached her apartment building. When she finally turned into her residential street, the SUV did not accelerate past her. Instead, it slowed, and then continued straight, as if it had never been following at all. Emily parked in her usual spot, and sat in the car for several seconds, scanning the street through her windshield. Nothing seemed out of place. No sign of the vehicle, no movement in the shadows. Only the quiet hum of the neighborhood at night. She slowly got out and walked toward the entrance of her building, key in hand, telling herself firmly that she was imagining patterns where none existed. But as she stepped inside and the door closed behind her, she did not see that across the street, parked beneath a dim streetlight, a black SUV remained still with its engine off, and inside it a man looked down at a small screen displaying the exact route she had taken home, his expression unreadable as he made a single quiet call, confirming she had arrived safely. Emily stood inside her apartment for a moment without turning on the lights, letting the silence of the room settle around her like a fragile cover, the city outside her window continuing its distant rhythm of traffic and light horns. She placed her keys on the small kitchen counter and exhaled slowly, trying to convince herself that the uneasy feeling from the drive home was fading now that she was inside a familiar space. Her apartment was small, simple, and quiet, a place she had worked hard to afford through long hours and strict discipline. Yet tonight it felt slightly different, as if the air itself carried a faint memory of being watched. She shook the thought away and walked toward the kitchen sink, turning on the faucet and letting cold water run over her hands, focusing on the physical sensation as a grounding exercise. When her phone buzzed again on the counter, she glanced at it hesitantly, expecting a work email or a message from a friend, but instead she saw another unknown number with a single line that made her pause. "You arrived home safely." She stared at the screen for a few seconds, her heartbeat rising slightly, then locked the phone and set it face down, telling herself firmly that it was likely a wrong number or some automated message. Still, she walked through her apartment and checked each window lock, more out of instinct than fear. As she moved through the dim space, she thought again about Alexander Reed. The way his voice had carried a strange weight earlier in the elevator, not aggressive, not kind, but precise in a way that lingered in memory longer than expected. Meanwhile, across the city, in a high-rise office building that overlooked downtown Chicago, Alexander stood in front of a wide glass window, his office lights dim except for the soft glow of a desk screen displaying a live map route. Daniel Brooks entered quietly holding a tablet and stopped a few steps behind him. "She made it home," Daniel said carefully. Alexander did not turn, his attention still fixed on the city lights below. "Yes," he replied simply, as if the outcome had already been accounted for long before it occurred. Daniel hesitated, then continued, "Do you want us to continue monitoring her schedule?" Alexander paused for a moment, his reflection barely visible against the glass, then answered, "Not her schedule," he said calmly. "Just her safety." Daniel nodded and left the office without another word. Emily, unaware of any of this, stood by her bedroom doorway later that night, looking out at the quiet street below her window. She told herself again that everything was normal, just a demanding job and a long week. Yet when she finally turned off the light and lay down, she could not ignore the strange certainty that the distance between her life and something far more controlled had quietly changed without permission, and somewhere in the city. Alexander Reed closed the map on his screen, as if confirming that a line had been drawn and it would not be crossed unnoticed. Emily woke up earlier than usual. Even though she had barely slept, the feeling of being unsettled lingering at the edge of her thoughts like a quiet warning she could not fully interpret. She sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, staring at the morning light filtering through her blinds and telling herself firmly that she was overthinking everything from the night before. The messages, the feeling of being observed, the presence of that black SUV. All of it had logical explanations she simply had not connected yet. She got ready for work with careful routine, choosing neutral clothing, tying her hair back, and focusing on normalcy, as if structure alone could reset her mind. When she arrived at Reed Enterprises, the building felt unchanged, tall glass walls reflecting the morning sky, employees moving with the same controlled urgency. Yet, as she stepped inside the lobby, she noticed a subtle shift in atmosphere. Conversations lowered slightly, eyes briefly tracked movement, then quickly looked away. Emily ignored it and continued toward the elevator. But as she waited, Daniel Brooks appeared beside her holding a tablet. "Good morning," he said politely. Though his tone carried a hint of caution, Emily returned the greeting. Morning. Is something going on today? Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. Normal schedule. Just an early executive meeting. The elevator arrived, and they stepped inside together, silence filling the mirrored space. Emily watched the numbers rise while Daniel glanced once at the screen on his tablet, then locked it immediately. When the doors opened on her floor, she stepped out and walked toward her desk, trying to settle into work. But within minutes, she noticed something unusual. Access to one of her shared project folders had been updated overnight with detailed corrections she did not request. The notes were precise, efficient, and far beyond what she would expect from routine review. She frowned slightly and turned to ask a colleague when she noticed the entire row of desks had fallen. Unusually quiet. A few employees were standing, attention directed toward the glass conference room at the far end of the office. Emily followed their gaze without meaning to and felt her step slow. Inside the conference room sat Alexander Reed, surrounded by senior executives, reviewing documents with calm focus. He did not look up immediately, but the moment he did, the room seemed to tighten, conversations paused, pens stopped moving, and even the air felt more structured. Emily quickly looked away, telling herself she had imagined the reaction. But a few minutes later, she received a message on her work system from internal administration. Her project had been reassigned for priority executive oversight. She stared at the notification, confused, and before she could process it fully, Daniel appeared again near her desk, lowering his voice slightly. Mr. Reed requested your project file this morning. Emily blinked. My project? That is not a senior-level assignment. Daniel gave a careful expression that suggested he was choosing his words. It is now. He replied simply. Emily felt a mix of frustration and confusion rise, but before she could respond, the conference room door opened and Alexander Reed stepped out, the entire office subtly shifting as he walked through it. He stopped near her desk without acknowledging anyone else, his gaze landing directly on her work screen. Your analysis is incomplete, he said calmly, not criticizing, simply stating fact. Emily straightened slightly. I was still refining it according to standard review timelines. Alexander studied her for a moment, then responded, standard timelines are not always efficient. There was no anger in his voice, only certainty, and that certainty made it difficult to argue. He turned slightly as if preparing to leave, then paused briefly. Stay later today, he added. There is something I want you to review personally. Before she could ask what he meant, he had already walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. And Emily realized for the first time that whatever distance she thought existed between her life and his world was no longer being maintained from her. Emily arrived at Reed Enterprises earlier than expected, carrying a sense of quiet hesitation that she could not fully explain. The building looked the same as always, glass walls reflecting the pale morning sky of Chicago, employees moving through the lobby with practiced urgency. Yet there was a subtle difference in how people avoided lingering eye contact, as if something unspoken had shifted overnight. She stepped into the elevator and rode up to her floor, watching the numbers climb, while trying to focus on her breathing and the routine of a normal workday. When the doors opened, she immediately noticed Daniel Brooks standing near her desk, not in his usual passing manner, but waiting as if he had been expecting her arrival. Good morning, he said, voice controlled and neutral. Emily nodded. Is there something unusual today? Daniel hesitated just slightly before responding. Nothing unusual officially, which was not an answer that brought comfort. Emily walked to her desk and opened her computer, but within seconds she noticed a new file structure already created in her system, organized in a level of detail she had not prepared herself. Her project had been reviewed and annotated with precision she did not recognize. She frowned and leaned closer to the screen when she heard subtle movement behind her. The office was quieter than usual, not empty, but restrained, like everyone was waiting for something. She turned slightly and saw multiple colleagues. Glancing toward the glass conference room at the far end of the floor, Emily followed their gaze and felt a faint tightening in her chest. Alexander Reed was inside the room, seated at the head of a long table, surrounded by senior executives, speaking in a calm, measured tone while reviewing documents. Even through the glass, his presence seemed to change the atmosphere of the entire floor. Conversations around Emily slowed without instruction. She returned her focus to her desk, but her attention was no longer steady. A few minutes later, Daniel approached again, this time lowering his voice slightly. Your project file has been moved to executive review status. Emily looked up immediately. That is not standard procedure for this level. Daniel gave a careful nod. It is now under his direction. Emily felt a mixture of confusion and concern. Before she could respond, the conference room door opened and Alexander Reed stepped out. The shift in the office was immediate, not dramatic but precise, like the building itself had recalibrated around his movement. He walked through the open space without acknowledging anyone directly until he reached her desk, stopping just within a natural conversational distance. He looked at her screen without asking permission, his expression calm and unreadable. Your projections are too conservative, he said evenly. Emily straightened slightly. They were based on last quarter's verified data. Alexander nodded once as if acknowledging the logic but not accepting it. Then the data is incomplete, he replied, his tone not critical but absolute. She hesitated, unsure how to respond without sounding defensive. He continued before she could speak. You stay after hours today. Emily blinked. That is not required for my position. Alexander finally shifted his gaze to her directly, and the room around them seemed to fade slightly into background noise. I am aware of your position, he said calmly. That is why I am asking. There was a pause that felt longer than it should have, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. Then he added, there is a level of detail I want you to see personally. Emily searched his expression for clarification but found none, only certainty. He turned slightly as if to leave, then stopped just long enough to add one final line. Do not leave early today. And then he walked away, leaving Emily standing in front of her desk with the uncomfortable realization that what she once thought of as coincidence was slowly becoming structure, and she was now part of it whether she had agreed or not. Emily tried to focus on her work after Alexander Reed left her desk, but the words he had spoken did not fade the way normal instructions did. They stayed in her mind with an unusual weight, as if they were not just about a task but about timing, intention, and something she had not yet been given full visibility into. The office slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Keyboards typing, phones ringing softly, muted conversations about deadlines and reports. Yet Emily felt slightly out of sync with it all, like she had been placed one step outside the pattern everyone else followed without question. She stayed at her desk longer than usual, reviewing files she already knew well, trying to convince herself that there was nothing unusual about being asked to stay late for a high-priority review. But as the afternoon shifted into evening, the building grew quieter in a way that felt more noticeable than comforting. Lights outside the glass walls of Reed Enterprises began to reflect deeper shades of orange and blue as the sun lowered over Chicago, and employees one by one gathered their things and left. Daniel Brooks passed her desk once, then again later, each time slowing slightly, as if considering whether to speak, but he never did, and that silence felt intentional rather than accidental. At exactly 6:45 in the evening, the last of her immediate coworkers left the floor, leaving only the soft hum of machines and the distant presence of security personnel near the elevators. Emily finally stood and stretched slightly, preparing to leave despite the earlier instruction, telling herself that staying later than necessary was not something she should normalize. She had just closed her laptop when the elevator doors opened at the far end of the floor and Alexander Reed stepped out alone. There were no executives with him this time, no assistants, only a quiet certainty in the way he moved through the space. Emily hesitated for a moment, then slowly sat back down. Alexander walked toward her without urgency, stopping a few feet away from her desk. His presence felt less like interruption and more like continuation of something already in motion. You were going to leave, he said calmly, not as a question but as observation. Emily steadied her voice. My work for today is complete. Alexander nodded once, as if acknowledging her logic, then placed a folder on the edge of her desk. Open it, he said. Emily hesitated before pulling it closer. Inside were structured reports, financial projections, and security summaries that did not belong to her department. Her eyes moved across the pages slowly, realizing these were not just business documents, but interconnected patterns she had never been exposed to. This is beyond my clearance level, she said carefully. Alexander replied without hesitation. Not anymore. There was no pressure in his tone, only certainty. Emily looked up from the documents, trying to understand why she was being shown this, why her name was being tied to information that required executive oversight. Alexander watched her for a moment, then spoke again. You notice details others ignore, he said. That is why you are here. Emily felt a subtle shift in the room. Not fear, not comfort, but awareness, as if the boundaries she had assumed were fixed were actually adjustable. She closed the folder slowly. And if I do not want to be part of this level of responsibility? She asked. Alexander's expression remained unchanged, but his voice lowered slightly. Then you would not still be sitting in this room. The statement was not a threat, but a fact delivered with absolute confidence. Emily looked around the empty office floor beyond the glass walls, realizing she was no longer simply working late. She was inside something structured far beyond her original role, and Alexander Reed had not asked her to stay. He had already decided she would. Emily remained seated long after Alexander Reed stopped speaking, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the folder he had given her. The office around them now almost completely silent as the last traces of the workday disappeared beyond the glass walls. She could feel the weight of what she had just been shown, not because she fully understood it, but because she understood enough to recognize it was not meant for someone in her position. Alexander stood near the window again, his attention directed outward toward the city lights of Chicago beginning to sharpen against the evening sky. You are thinking too much, he said without turning around, as if reading the silence behind her rather than her expression. Emily exhaled slowly. I am trying to understand why I am involved in something that does not belong to my department. Alexander finally turned, his expression calm but deliberate. Because departments are boundaries, and boundaries are only useful until they are not. Emily shook her head slightly, still trying to maintain a professional distance in her voice. I am a financial analyst, not an executive decision-maker. Alexander stepped away from the window and approached the desk again, stopping at a distance that was neither close nor distant, but controlled. Titles describe assignment, not capability, he replied. Emily looked down at the folder again, then back up at him. And what exactly do you believe my capability is? She asked. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her for a brief moment that felt longer than necessary, as if evaluating something beyond her words. You notice inconsistencies, he finally said. Patterns others ignore because they are trained to. Emily felt a slight tension in her chest, not discomfort, but awareness that the conversation had shifted into something more precise than corporate instruction. She closed the folder gently. That does not explain why you are personally involved. Alexander's gaze remained steady. Because some patterns require confirmation before they expand. Emily stood slowly now, her posture more grounded as she tried to regain control of the situation. And if I refuse? She asked. Alexander's expression did not change, but his voice lowered slightly. You will still notice the same inconsistencies tomorrow and the day after that, and eventually you will either ignore them or follow them. There was a brief silence between them, not tense, but structured, as if the outcome had already been accounted for in advance. Emily looked toward the glass walls of the office, the city beyond them now fully lit, alive with movement and distance she could easily return to if she chose. But something about the space she stood in felt different now, not physically changed, but defined in a way it had not been before. She turned back to Alexander, her voice quieter but steady. You are not asking me to work later hours anymore, she said. Alexander nodded once. No, he replied. I am asking you to understand why you are still here. Emily felt the meaning of his words settle slowly, not as pressure, but as recognition of a shift she had already begun to feel without naming it. She glanced once more at the folder, then at him, realizing that whatever line she had thought existed between her normal life and his world was no longer being approached from the outside. And Alexander Reed had not opened a door for her. He had simply confirmed she was already inside. Emily stood still for a long moment after Alexander Reed finished speaking, the silence between them no longer feeling empty but structured, as if even quietness inside Reed Enterprises followed rules she had not been taught yet. The city lights outside the glass walls of the office had fully taken over the sky now, stretching across Chicago in deep tones of blue and gold, reflecting faintly against the polished surfaces of the conference room where they remained alone. Emily finally closed the folder he had given her, not because she understood everything inside it, but because she understood enough to know it represented something far larger than her daily responsibilities. She looked at Alexander carefully, searching for any sign that this was an overreach or a misunderstanding that could be corrected with logic or boundaries. But his expression remained unchanged, calm in a way that felt intentional rather than distant. "I want you to be clear about something," Emily said slowly, choosing her words with care. "I did not ask to be involved in anything beyond my role." Alexander nodded once, acknowledging her statement without resistance. "That is correct," he replied. And the simplicity of his answer made her pause, because it did not attempt to persuade her otherwise. Emily took a breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle more fully. "Then why am I still here?" she asked. Alexander turned slightly toward the window again, as if organizing his thoughts in the reflection of the city below. "Because involvement is not always initiated," he said calmly. "Sometimes it is recognized." Emily frowned slightly. "Recognized by whom?" Alexander looked back at her, his voice steady. "By the system you already interact with every day without seeing it." The statement lingered in the air between them, not as a threat, but as a shift in perspective. Emily glanced down at the folder once more, her fingers resting on its edge, then back up at him. "You are saying this is not about me specifically," she said, trying to anchor the conversation in something she could define. Alexander stepped closer, but not into her space, stopping at a distance that remained controlled. "It is about patterns you noticed before I ever spoke to you," he replied. "You corrected projections others ignored, you flagged inconsistencies that were dismissed, and you questioned results that were assumed to be final." Emily felt a subtle tightening in her chest, not fear, but realization that her instincts had been observed long before this conversation. "And what happens now?" she asked. Alexander paused briefly, then answered, "Now you are no longer limited to reporting what you see." Emily studied him carefully, the professional certainty she had always relied on still present, but now tested by a situation that did not fit within any standard structure she had been trained for. She finally spoke again, her voice quieter but firm. "And if I decide I do not want this level of responsibility?" Alexander met her gaze without hesitation. "Then you will continue to notice what you have always noticed," he said. "The only difference is whether you choose to ignore it or understand it." The words were not forceful, yet they carried a sense of inevitability that made them difficult to dismiss. Emily turned slightly toward the glass wall, looking out over the city of Chicago stretching endlessly into the night, realizing that her life had already begun to shift before she was fully aware of the decision being made. When she turned back, Alexander had not moved, but the space between them no longer felt like an office conversation. It felt like a threshold she had already crossed without stepping back. And after a long pause, Emily finally spoke in a measured voice. "If I stay in this, it is on my terms as well." Alexander regarded her for a moment, then gave a single calm nod. "Then you are already thinking correctly," he said. And in that quiet exchange there was no declaration of ownership, only acknowledgement that whatever came next was no longer about being invited, but about choosing to remain aware of what she had finally begun to see.